This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
This is Greg LeBlanc. Welcome to Unsiloed, and I'm here today with César Hidalgo, who is the director of the Center for Collective Learning at University of Toulouse. I hope I got that correctly. And he used to be at MIT Media Labs. And he is the author of, most recently, this book right here, which is called How Humans Judge Machines. He's co-author of this study, which is described in depth in this book. And also this one right here, which is Why Information Grows, the Evolution of Order from Atoms to Economies. Welcome, César.
Welcome. Sorry. Thank you for having me here. Yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm a bit welcomed into your into Toulouse after talking a bit about it. You got me longing for the sunshine and everything. But I want to start off talking about this book, Why Information Grows. And just before we started recording, we were talking about how this book has appealed to a lot of people in Silicon Valley. And I think in part it's because you kind of trespass without permission into probably a dozen different disciplines. I mean, there is network theory, there is sociology, there's economics, there's physics, there's information theory. There's so many different disciplines that are all kind of brought together. So this to me was just it was like a roller coaster ride, and I really, really enjoyed it. And so I thought we'd start by talking about that book. And when I teach my strategy class, I always start with this image of a pediment from a Greek temple, and it depicts the allegory of the Lapiths, right? And the Lapiths were these Greek people who were besieged on all sides by the centaurs. It's a famous battle from Greek mythology. And I say that this really depicts the constant struggle that we have between order and chaos. The struggle against entropy, and of course in business, entropy means perfect competition, right? And so it's a very metaphorical use of the term. But this book is in many ways about the expansion of information and keeping entropy at bay. And so I learned a lot from this book because, for people who aren't physicists, what little we know about physics, we know that, matter and energy, these things, there's a constant, and, you can't really expand or contract the combination of these two things. And then, we also learned something about how there is this constant urge towards chaos and towards disorder. But in your book, you talk about how we are continuously increasing the amount of information or order in our world. And this seems a bit counterintuitive. One would think that there's like a constant level of chaos or order, and that we're just kind of reorganizing things and reshuffling things. I think, Diderot famously talked about how, individuals came from little pieces of dirt, and then they went back to little pieces of dirt, and it was just this constant flux. So how is it that we can see a constant increase in the amount of information and the reduction in the amount of disorder, entropy in the world?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And of course, I'm not the first one to ask that question, and that part of the book builds a lot on the work of a Nobel Prize winner called Ilya Prigozhin. He was a Russian-born, but then Belgian physicist and chemist, who was the father of thermodynamics out of equilibrium. Because in some way before him, there was a lot of people that started to study thermodynamics. Thermodynamics was a field that grew enormously during the 19th century. At that time, like the steam engine, the heat engine, all of these engines were like what today, computer science and AI are. They were like at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, and what now you would think of as the forefront of the science that was pushing that Industrial Revolution was that science of thermodynamics. And people figured out that, thermodynamics was driven by, some certain potential. So you could estimate where a system would end up if you understood the potential that the system satisfied. But Prigozhin later was able to look at thermodynamics that was out of equilibrium. And he figured out that in the systems that were out of equilibrium, you could have the spontaneous generation of order. And there's a beautiful example that he provides, and I echo in my book, which is, when you have a bathtub or a receptacle that is full of water, and when that is all still, the water molecules are going in every direction. They're following Brownian motion. So in some sense, they achieve that maximum entropy state, and they stay there. But when you remove the plunger and the water starts racing down the drain, now the system is no longer in equilibrium. And as the molecules of water start, racing down the drain, they're trying to find a way to fall into that sink, and that generates this spontaneous order in which a little whirlpool forms. And that whirlpool, it's actually, a system in which now there's correlation between the speeds, and there's a profile of speeds of the molecules as you go, from the center of the whirlpool to the edges, and that helps organize the entire surrounding of, the water that is falling into the drain in a state of lower entropy than the one I was before. But it can do so only as long as the water keeps on falling, as long as basically energy is being spent. Now, as a consequence of that, of course, there's some friction that happens, and there's, entropy that is being created. So the system is reducing entropy locally, but it's increasing some of that entropy more globally by sweating it at the edges. And that's a very profound insight, because it tells us, like in the example that you were mentioning before, we come from dirt, we go back to being dirt, but in between, we're kind of like that little whirlpool that, for 70, 80, 90 years, if we're lucky, as long as we eat and we, stay healthy, we are able to sustain this insane amount of order that is expressed, in our DNA, that is available in each one of the, cells of our body, in the molecules that these cells help form, but also, the order that we, of course, start to generate in our brain as we start, to create synapses and remember things. So it is all about these out of equilibrium systems, and you can think of it in the whirlpool, you can think of it in the context of humans, and you can think of it in the context of our planet, because our planet is being bathed by energy from the sun every day, and that is, one of the reasons why we have been able to develop life, and we have been able to develop economies here, because it is the use of that energy, whether it is the energy that we harvest directly from the sun, or the one that is in that, saving accounts that we call underground mineral deposits, is the one that allows us to, keep that order running, is to, take the rock out of the mountain and build a castle, is the one that allows us to create this society that is complex, is full of, intricacies, and that would not be able to live if that energy would go away. That would basically, disappear, because you need to keep the system running to keep it organized.
Right. Yeah, I think you referred to Earth as this little island of information in the vast kind of chaos of the cosmos, and that was I love that image. But when we talk about information, so information is a term that's used in pretty much every discipline, and it seems like everyone uses it a bit differently. We have information economics. I teach data science, and one of the first things that we do in data science, one of the first questions that I ask students is, what is information? And of course, everyone kind of bounces around. Nobody really comes up with a good explanation. But to data scientists, right, information is uncertainty reduction, right? And it is about kind of entropy reduction. But in those states where you have the least amount of entropy, in some sense, that is a state where there's kind of less information. In other words, it's easier to communicate that state, right? If we define information as the number of bits that we need in order to communicate information about a state, then it would seem like the most chaotic state is the one that requires the most information to describe, right? Like a photo album were deleted and replaced with, just pure static, that would actually increase kind of the amount of information, according to one definition. So are there these definitions of information that are in tension? How do you define information in this way that allows for its kind of continual growth?
Yeah. So in some way, there is a bit of a confusion because the same formula was discovered, in the theory of communication of Nyquist and Shannon, and in statistical physics. So is this formula for entropy, which in physics has a very interesting interpretation, which is basically the number of microstates that are compatible with a macro state. So let's say that we have like people, in the bleachers of a stadium, and we give them, red and blue cardboards, and they could create pictures, they can create patterns, doing that. Basically, if we would define like a macro state, for instance, half of the panels being red, half of the panels being blue, how many combinations we have that are compatible with that macro state, that would be the entropy of that state, And it's easy there to realize that, well, in the state that all of the panels are red or all of the panels are blue, there's only one combination. But in the one that they're half and half, there's a lot of different combinations that can happen. And what this idea that entropy gets maximized in the universe eventually means, from a very simple perspective, is that state that has many combinations is so large that systems end up in it no matter what. Now, when we talk about information in the context of like the theory of communication of Shannon, we're talking about the number of yes or no questions that we need to answer to guess a message. So now people would have kind of like those, those cardboards, up on the bleachers, and you would have to guess if they're making the picture of a dog or whether they're making a Pac-Man or whether they're all random and so forth. Now, if we would know something about the macro state, let's say if we know that all of the same color, doing that guess would be very easy. But if we know that half of them are red and half of them are blue, then guessing, the exact, microstate is going to be very hard, and we're going to need a lot of questions. So we're going to need a lot of information to specify that microstate. So I think that's sort of like one way to a little bit reconcile those two ideas, which is given sort of like that macro state, how many yes or no questions you will need to do to discover the microstate. If it's a high entropy macro state, you're going to need, a lot of yes or no questions, meaning that you're going to need to communicate more information, because in the first case, when they're all the same, you just say it's blue or it's red, just one bit and you're done. In the other case, you're going to have to figure out a way to start partitioning that space to figure out, different portions of it or different rows and columns, and it will take you much longer.
Right. So the way you're thinking about information is really, the state of order, which may actually be kind of easier to communicate, require less kind of yes/no questions in order to communicate. In other words, there's correlations and there's structure. I love the example that you use about the luxury car that crashes, and you talk about how when this car crashes, information is lost, right? There's really only a small number of ways that this Bugatti can be organized and function properly, but there's almost an infinite number of ways that this thing can be dysfunctional, right, when it smashes into the wall. And so in what sense, what is this object kind of frozen information, right? I think that's one of the key messages of your book, is that, physical objects that were created for some reason contain information, that they're vehicles for information. They're kind of buckets into which we deposit information.
That's one of the things that I think as a physicist, I help, bring maybe through the book to a more general audience, which is people tend to think of information as something that is non-physical, but in some way, everything has to have some sort of physical embodiment, So people think that, hey, words are non-physical, but, it's very hard to speak in the vacuum. The words are not because actually you're encoding, in that case, information in the way that the sound waves, are made of pressure waves in the air. Similarly, light is used to encode information and so forth, and we tend to, understand that information and communication are related. But when we understand that information is physical, you can think, well, when I organize things, I could be organizing bits on a hard drive, but I could also be organizing, sticks, on a structure. Is that information too? And the answer is yes. Like any form of physical order that you produce, whether it is for the purpose of communicating with others or not, it has, a content of information from a physical perspective, not from the communication perspective, but from that physical entropy perspective that we were discussing. So once you get there, you realize, well, your phone, even when it's shut down and turned off, it has, information in part that is stored, on the hard drive, and it's information that involves communication in part in the hardware itself. When you look at, a car, when you look at a computer, when you look at a camera, a microphone, a shoe, a refrigerator, all of those things that are not going to appear naturally, out of a mountain are also things that involve information. The only thing that would appear naturally, of course, that includes a lot of information, are things that are alive, like think of an apple. Of course, it's made of cells and so forth. An onion, an animal, they are also rich in terms of information. But information is not only connected to communication. Information is connected to all forms of physical order, and that is beautiful because it allows you to communicate other things. And that's a little bit of like the inside of the book, which is that when you put information in a message, you can communicate with someone. But when you put information in an object, you can pass on the practical uses of your knowledge. So if I create an object that allows you to do something, if I create a phone, I allow you to communicate with people at long distances. If I create, a hot air balloon, I allow you to go up in the sky and, and survey the land. These are things that I cannot do simply by communicating, but I can do by encoding information in objects that help me, amplify those practical uses of knowledge and distribute it through the population.
Right. You said that, the existence of solids, the existence of a solid state is necessary in order to encode this information. And you gave this example of, freezing a whirlpool. Like if you could freeze a whirlpool, then this would essentially take that kind of steady state of disequilibrium and package it in a way that could be considered lasting information.
So solids, yes, they're important, and I think the whirlpool example is more metaphorical than physical, but a better example would be DNA. So imagine you have a molecule of DNA contains like information that then you can unpack in the context of creating or building a life. But because of thermodynamics, that molecule of DNA is under pressure of being getting disorganized, like switching sometimes some, bases for others. And in some sense, what temperature means is that there is some randomness or disorder going on in the system. So at higher temperatures, it's really hard to keep that order, and our body, of course, is always fighting and working to kind of keep our DNA in the way that it needs to be, keeps the proteins, properly folded and so forth. And as you get, for instance, like a high fever, the problem of like having like a fever when it gets really high is that those processes start to fail. So because of that battle between creating order and the natural tendency of the universe to unfold that order, when you have a solid and you're able to crystallize those bits, or to crystallize that organization, you're able to accumulate more of it because the one that you are able to save, you don't need to recreate, so you can add to it. In a world in which everything would be fluid, it would be really hard because it would be hard to save the progress that you made at creating that order. And that's why life in some way builds, its complexity in its ability to create molecules that have very long-term memories, like DNA, that are very stable under a bunch of conditions, because that's the way that we can preserve, that order, that information, not only through our life but through generations.
Well, you talked about, you used the metaphor of the apple, right? The apple that you eat and the apple that you write your book on. And you said that, in many ways they're kind of the same thing, right? They're kind of crystallized information. But in some ways they're different, right? Obviously, one is kind of crystallized imagination. And so there's almost a kind of a qualitative leap there that was made, and you allude to this distinction between kind of knowledge and know-how, and then you tried to tie the two together by saying that maybe with an organism there is kind of the knowledge of what the I think you used the example of the seed, right? And the seed has both the knowledge of the plant, but also kind of the know-how of how to kind of build this plant from scratch. So does that mean that knowledge and know-how exist both in kind of the apple that we eat and also the apple that we kind of write our books on, or is there some fundamental difference?
Yeah, so just to kind of like clarify some of those definitions for our listeners, so we hopefully now are all on the same page that you can use information to encode messages, or you can use information in objects to communicate the practical uses of knowledge. Now, what is knowledge? So knowledge is different from information, and it's related to that capacity to create or read that information. And you can find it in biology, you can find it in society. In the case of a seed, you have information on the DNA, but a seed is not just a little piece of DNA that gets thrown out the window and falls into the ground and a plant grows from there. There's a lot of things that go together because it's a full cell, with a lot of other molecular machines that are able to unpack that piece of information that exists in the DNA into the creation of, the plant. So similarly, in the case of humans,
whereas
like
if I buy a shoe, right, there's knowledge in this shoe, but the know-how of how to build the shoe, I can't necessarily infer it from possession of the shoe, right?
Exactly. So the knowledge is going to be on people, and it's going to be on the networks that people form, on the teams that, of course, can consume that information and they can do something with it and they can produce new information. But it is the packing of the knowledge and the know-how what is hard and what it's difficult to move across geographies. So a lot of the book then goes into that, that even though we can communicate the practical uses of our knowledge by creating objects, having the knowledge that we need to create objects that are actually relevant, important, that endow us with key capacities is very difficult. Building planes or building telecommunication networks is something that single individuals cannot do and require these large teams. And it is that unpacking of that knowledge and know-how what is hard. By knowledge, I mean explicit knowledge, the one that can be communicated. And by know-how, I mean the tacit knowledge, the one that can only be learned through experience, and involves, either muscle memory or having work in close relationship with others to learn things that are not easy to communicate in a book or in a message.
Well, before we get into economies and societies, we can still talk about computation, right? So I think you used this metaphor that a tree is a computer powered by sunlight, and so you walk through these kind of stages where at first we need solids and then we need computation in order to have a world where this information grows, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there is kind of like this sort of dance or duality between like our ability to store information. And our ability to then unpack it by having the processes that allow what I there would call computation, which is this ability to create information, to read and write it. In a tree you have that process too, because as the tree reproduces its cells and let's say grows a limb, grows a branch, it is in some way harvesting the energy of the sun to, produce new molecules of DNA, because that DNA is getting replicated, to produce, a number of different organelles, as the tree is growing. So the book is, in some sense, using its knowledge to self-replicate, and also to run other programs as you think, for instance, photosynthesis, which is this ability to then capture carbon from the air, that the tree's then gonna use to build its own structure. So that's a little bit of the analogy that I tried to build on there.
Right, and then when you move to the level of the economy, you kind of define an economy as a system which amplifies knowledge and know-how through the physical embodiment of information, right? You talk about an economy as sort of an amplification engine. Now, I think all of us now would probably agree that we live in the knowledge economy, right? And that everything's built on knowledge. I think economic historians would say, well, that's kind of always been the case, right?
Yeah.
It's there's that's what it means to be, human, is that we kind of traffic in this knowledge. But I think it's obvious. It's much more obvious now. But what did you really mean by that? What does that illustrate, to think of the economy as not the kind of exchange of goods and services, but really as kind of a amplification engine for knowledge?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, like the economy involves like this growth of productivity, doing more with less. Yes. And that ability to do more with less can only grow as long as, the things that we do, or the way that we do things, changes over time, and those changes come, from knowledge. So like our ability to crystallize information into products, that ability to create to product, and honestly, creating products is key, because services are not that scalable. Is one of the things that, of course, allows us to increase our productivity, because it is what eventually technology ends up being. It's, now you have a farmer that is able to run a farm of many hectares, with a very small crew, because, of the mechanization of farm labor and the sophistication that has happened over the last, 100 years. Yeah. So that's a little bit like what I mean is like, well, we have a society in which, we are trying to fight entropy to create, these objects that are rich in information. But what these objects help us do is they help us amplify those practical uses of knowledge. So there's few people that have that knowledge on how to build that tractor, or how to, synthesize that fertilizer, or to do any of those things. And that knowledge is very useful, but if it's not crystallized into a product, if it doesn't transform into something that can be reproduced, manufactured, and shared, it's going to have a very limited impact on the productivity of the world. And it's that ability to go all the way to product, that allows that knowledge to eventually escape the circle of its own creators, and, for its practical uses to be amplified. So today we live in a world in which we all can do amazing stuff, because we're able to do things that we have no clue how to build, and we live in this world in which, we are kind of like superhuman, and at the same time extremely limited in our individual capacities, because of these knowledge amplification capacities that products give you. So products are not just kind of like one thing here or there in the economy. They're actually something that is really key. It's very different from a service, because it has that scalable property of being able to endow others with the practical uses of knowledge that otherwise would be trapped in a small team.
So, but are you using the term product kind of metaphorically in part? I mean, if we think about, say, licensing intellectual property or something like that, right? If we take the division of labor, and instead of thinking about it like, all right, I'm going to, send you some buttons, and then you add the buttons to the, to the jacket. Instead, I'm going to send you like a template, or I'm going to send you kind of a blueprint, and then you would, build off that blueprint, right? I think that blueprint for you would count as a product,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think of product in a very broad sense. Like, for instance, today we live in a world in which we have a lot of software products, and I make a big difference between, a firm that makes, services in the software industry and one that makes software products. For instance, Google, like Gmail, is a software product. Like there's a very small marginal cost of getting a new user. The product kind of like in some sense is scalable, works, in a similar way of like a physical product in that it has that scalability of manufacturing, and the ability to reach those large markets, even though, it's software and some people would classify it as service. Well, there are other things that occur in the software world that would not qualify as products because, you need more people working on them, the more clients you would have. So there's some, for example, firms that would do, advertisement videos through the web. And the more clients they get, the more people they have to have on their, offices clicking around and creating those animations for them and reaching to the clients. Well, in that case, it's not, something that has that product-like property. That product-like property is really that one that allows something to explode. And I think that's why, all of VCs are always searching for product firms, because product firms have kind of like that potential scalability.
It's kind of interesting because, I think ex ante, you would think that it would be easier to transmit kind of information in some raw state than to transfer, goods. I mean, even though we've seen this massive reduction in the cost of moving goods around the world, right, over the last, couple of decades, we talk about how transmitting data is, more or less free, right? I mean, you push a button and you send a packet of information. But knowledge, it's actually quite sticky and it's quite local and it's quite specific. In economics, we often refer to aluminum as kind of frozen electricity, right? And we usually locate the aluminum plants right next to the cheap sources of electricity because it's easier to ship solid aluminum than to kind of transmit the electricity over thousands of miles and of wires and so forth. And I think part of your argument is that products are, frozen knowledge, and, transferring the know-how that went into the construction of this. That's kind of sticky. That's sort of, local. It's specific, and hard to move around. Why is that? Why is it the case that know-how is sticky? Is it because it's embodied in our, individual people's minds or the network of people that happen to be in contact with one another in some physical way?
Yeah. So knowledge and know-how they have a lot of properties that I think we've discovered over the last, few decades. We know that, for example, knowledge is non-rival. We know that knowledge can be tacit or explicit. So, I call tacit knowledge know-how in the book. But one property that to me it's extremely important is that, knowledge is complex. And what I mean by that is that it is not kind of like a one thing. It's not like a dough that is undifferentiated and you can have more of it. It's not like an aggregate quantity. And any model, that looks at knowledge from an aggregate perspective can only go so far because a better analogy, it is like a very large periodic table. And this periodic table has, a lot of different rows and columns, of different types of knowledge that can be specific to an industry, to an occupation, to a task, to a certain part of the process. And when you work with people, you start realizing that, you don't need a salesperson. You need a salesperson that has worked on this industry and on this segment and on this market and with these people, because knowledge can be super specific. So because that combination is so large, because knowledge is complex, meaning that there's a lot of uniqueness to the pieces of knowledge that need to be combined and that are complementary. You need to store knowledge in groups of people. It's teams, the ones that have the knowledge. It's not individuals. It's like this Theseus ship, like Google, I'm sure that is, having turnover of people every year, like maybe by the thousands, but, the ship keeps on going because as you change the parts, it sort of is the same ship. And it's very hard for any of those people that are coming in or out to create something similar on the side, because, it is this large ship that you're changing the parts from, the one that holds, the knowledge. And that's what makes knowledge really hard, to transfer because that complexity, the fact that it's a big periodic table, it's a gigantic alphabet, means that it has to be stored in networks of people. So it's not in small teams. It may be in a firm. It may be sometimes, in an industry, in a location. Like, Silicon Valley knows more than any of the companies in Silicon Valley knows individually. And moving that, it's extremely hard. It's easier to bring people into those communities than to bring the knowledge out of those communities into other locations. So knowledge at the end of the day, when we look at the empirical research that, and I've done a lot of empirical research in this space, is the more sophisticated an activity, the more it concentrates in space. And in some way, as our society becomes more of a knowledge society, even the forces of inequality become larger, because few people can create things that are so scalable, so productive, and that they can be exported to everywhere, with very small transportation costs, that you are competing now in these global markets in which the incentive to co-localize with other people that are very complementary to you and that have the pieces of the puzzle that you don't have is what drives, the location of the most sophisticated sectors.
Well, you introduced a couple terms which I really liked. One was called person byte, and the other one was firm byte. And it's kind of, how much information can you have within a single kind of human brain or body? And, I don't think that any individual human being now has more information than, say, the hunter-gatherer did, 10,000 years ago. In fact, we might even have less, right? They're probably smarter than we are, right? Or, our brains are cluttered with the names of, football players and actors and so forth. And theirs were, filled with the different types of species they were surrounded with. But nonetheless, we've seen this massive increase in information and knowledge. And this is not simply because we have more people, right? So, if you add up the total amount of kind of information within all those brains, if there is this capacity and everybody's kind of at this capacity, then, it should just kind of scale linearly. But I think you're arguing that no, that's not the case. It's sort of growing almost exponentially. Even if the population were to, start shrinking, it would not get in the way of this increase in the overall amount of information. And is that simply because the information is encoded in, objects, or is there something more to it? And I think you made this point that if you had someone on a desert island with access to the total sum of all the world's knowledge, they probably wouldn't be able to still do very much, except maybe, Google how to start a fire with sticks or something like that, but they wouldn't be able to do much more than that.
So no, I think you're right, and in some way, it has to be something that goes beyond population, because if it was just a function of population, you wouldn't see the huge differences in income and productivity and economic structure that you see in the world. So, Germany and Ethiopia have a very similar population, but what is manufactured in Germany and what is manufactured in Ethiopia is very different. And that means that there are groups of people in Germany that know how to, manufacture the BMWs and the Mercedes that get produced there that do not exist, in the case of, Ethiopia. So in the book, I look a little bit about the things that help people connect, because in some way, it's not just about people, it's about the cost that people face when connecting with others, and I look at it from two perspectives. One that is more, traditional economics, like a new institutional theory, like Coase, Williamson, which is the idea of transaction cost, and basically, what that says is that firms are always looking to whether, buy or make. And as firms grow, eventually they hit kind of like a boundary in which making is undesirable. So they prefer to buy, and that defines the boundary of the firm. You don't want to hire people, you want to buy services or products from the market. But there is another, theory that also, comes from the Bay Area. And, to me, is someone that I've mentioned him many times to economists, and even though he's a very highly cited guy, it's not well known within the economics community, which is Mark Granovetter, and he's the creator of all of this economic sociology field. And basically what he did and what he says is that, look, there is something, or there's a different way to think about this, which is we don't live in a world in which people are just like, rational agents that are going around and they find people to interact with and they interact with them because it's beneficial. We live in a world in which people grow up in families, go to school, make friends, have sports teams. They have a lot of other mechanisms that help them create relationships with others. And the economy is sort of built on top of that skeleton, that scaffold that get formed for other reasons. So you start a venture with your friend from college, or you make a business deal with your cousin-in-law, or your brother-in-law, whatever, like that, because you are searching for people within that network that you have, because the network has trust, and trust is a way to reduce those transaction costs, So there, I also go into the work of Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama wrote a wonderful book on trust, and the idea here is that a society that has low levels of trust is a society in which people need to invest a lot to know if you have to trust someone else. So a society with low levels of trust actually is a society that in some ways is going to be more relational in many ways, because if it's not easy for me to trust you, I have to go to dinner, you have to go to my house, I have to go to your house. We have to kind of like almost, become like brothers for me to go into business with you. In a society with high level of trust, you can very easily like, hey, you do this, I do that, let's try to do something together. And
so it supports a higher level of complexity, right? I mean, it supports
exactly.
a higher level of division of labor. It supports a higher level of connectedness, and therefore higher level of complexity, right?
Exactly. So you can have more links, you can create larger networks, and if you need networks to accumulate knowledge, you can accumulate more knowledge. In the US, it's commonplace for people to sometimes grow a company from a garage to 5,000 people in less than 5 years. That's really unique. In very few parts of the world, organizations can go to that scale that quickly, and that tells you something about, society and the institutions that you have there, and also the lack of those institutions and that culture in other places. And that's why it's not just about people. It's a lot about, the cost of connection. If the cost of connection is low, might be more important than the number of people that you have. Like a little country, like Singapore, can have networks that are much smarter collectively than a larger country with a much larger population and connections that are of lesser quality.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you that the transaction cost economics and economic sociology are complements. They fit together really well. And you talk a lot about standards, and in business strategy we talk a lot about standards, and you didn't use the term, but you talked about chunking. I usually think in terms of modularity, right? Very, very similar concepts. And I think what I'm seeing right now is almost an exponential growth in complexity in business ecosystems because of APIs, right? APIs are kind of like those standards that allow for ever greater division of labor, ever greater chunking, and ever greater complexity, right? Do you see kind of new forms of organization in these business ecosystems as kind of a continuation of this story that you've been describing?
Yeah, and for example, like I've been looking a lot at the API space in AI, because I think like AI like 5 years ago was something like, oh wow, this is new, this is cool, everybody should get into this. And today, a lot of things that involve AI right now are starting to be served as API services, which make AI very tradable. So AI is not something that you need to build within your organization. It's something that you can get as a service. So if you want to summarize text, you go to Google, you search for summarized text AI API, you get a bunch of ads because they're competing with each other already. There's a bunch of companies that are trying to get into the market. And we have been using in my company the GPT-3 engine, which sure, you can try to trip it and find ridiculous stuff, but if you're trying to use it in a way that is going to be useful to you, it's amazing what it can do. And I have a company of 30 people. We're never going to be able to, reproduce something like that. It's not our expertise, but we would be very interested on paying for that service, that you can hit the API and you can ask, questions that that API is able to respond, or services that it can do. So in the space of AI, I see that chunking happen, very quickly, in which it went from something that a lot of countries were trying to enter or compete to a space in which now there's a few players that have been able to create large, good models that are very tradable, and is going to be a space, the software sector is a high export sector. It's extremely high export sector. And I think AI is moving very quickly also into that direction because of that chunking of the APIs.
Yeah, and we even call it productizing,
Yep.
right? You take something that you've developed internally and you productize it. And the minute you productize it, then all of a sudden it's in a form that others can benefit from, and ultimately increases the overall complexity. This is probably a good time to switch gears here and switch to this book here. This book is, I think, very timely because it talks about how we should be thinking about, or actually it's not about how we should, it's how people are thinking about the increasing presence of automated decision-making, out there with machine learning and AI. And it's kind of a work of, I don't know, experimental philosophy? Is that what you would call it?
Social psychology from a technical perspective. So I work with a couple of postdocs of mine who were psychologists, and what you're doing is a clinical trial in which you have some people exposed to a scenario in a control condition. They see the scenario as the action of a human. And there's another group of people that experience the same scenario in the treatment condition, which would be the scenario being presented to them as the action of a machine. And, that's how social psychologists usually do experiments. In this case, it's a between subject study. So there's two different groups of people that get exposed, to a variation of the stimuli. And it's a very powerful technique because it allows you to basically identify differences that are based only on that small variation that you introduce. In our case was, the subject of the sentence, the one that was performing the action, whether it was a human or a machine.
And I think the original motivation was this recognition that there exists this algorithm aversion, right? So when we find out that an autonomous vehicle has hit someone, we're kind of outraged in a way that we wouldn't if it was a human being, right? In many cases, if it's an accident, if the human being is, I don't know, they drop their coffee on their lap and then they hit someone, right? We're usually we accept that. We know that this is a natural part of people driving. And so the concern is that even if autonomous driving is radically safer than humans, it's going to have to be, 10x safer before people are willing to accept it. But I think what you discovered is that it's not that simple, right? It's not that simple. We don't simply say negative consequences that come from algorithmic decision-making are automatically worse. There's a bit of subtlety in there, and it kind of boils down to, which part of our immorality is affected, right?
Yeah. So I think there's two things in the book that help add nuance to the discussion, because it is easy to dismiss this idea by simply saying, people prefer humans to machines, and that's all there is to it. But in the book, we found like two ways, that I think give us some texture. One of them is that it depends on the moral dimension. So in moral dimensions that are related to harm, when you have, physical harm, where you have an accident that causes harm in a population, all of those things, there we do see that people tend to judge machines very harshly compared to how they judge humans in the same situation. But in scenarios involving fairness, people tend to judge the humans a little bit harsher than the machines. So we have, for example, a scenario in which, a songwriter or an algorithm, is found out to have plagiarized songs, when, it was tasked to produce song for some singers. And in that case, people judge the human much harsher. Then we have a lot of examples on algorithmic bias, involving university admissions, policing, salary increases. And there people also tend to judge, humans a little bit harsher than machines. Not a lot, but a little bit harsher than machines. So now when we zoom out, and this is kind of like the other result of the book, and we look at all of those scenarios together and we say, well, what is going on here? Is it that people like humans more than they like machines? Or is there something more? And we find that there's something more, that people use a different moral philosophy to judge humans and to judge machines. We judge humans with a moral philosophy that is based on what the person was trying to do. It's about intention, motivation. And we judge machines with a moral philosophy that is consequentialist. What is the outcome of the scenario? We don't care if the machine was trying to do the right thing, was trying to rescue the people, was trying to avoid the accident, even though we can put these things explicitly on the scenarios. Like, people care about the outcome. So we're very utilitarian, very consequentialist when we're judging machines, and we tend to be more Kantian, we tend to care more about like the motivation, the intentions of people when we're judging humans. And there's some, like, to me, like, what is a very interesting figure is that you can put this in mathematical terms, and these are kind of like planes, one that is a little bit rotated from the other, and it's that rotation the one that shows you kind of like these different moral philosophies.
Yeah, I love the idea of this function that you developed, right? Which was where the kind of there's intent, then there's the impact on these five sources of morality, and then there's the identity of the actor, and all of those are going to be combined into some kind of measure of wrongness, right? I really like that, but it does seem a little contrary to what we're seeing, at least in the news, right? So we see all sorts of awareness, at least in Silicon Valley, about algorithmic bias, and there's much less discussion about kind of the human biases that it's replacing, right? We don't typically see them kind of evaluated side by side. In many cases, even when the algorithm is kind of less biased, it seems like people are more concerned. Why do you suppose that is? Is it because it seems to be contrary to what you're suggesting? Is that just an impression that people are getting from the media right now? There's this kind of backlash against kind of algorithms.
Yeah, so I do think there is a little bit of that. In part, like, one of the things that motivated me to write the book is that I would see all of the moralizing that was going on without proper counterfactuals. And I'm a big believer that when you judge things like the ones that we're judging in the book, it's important to also judge at the margin, meaning, is it improving the situation or not compared to the current state of affairs? And I didn't see that happening. So, for instance, in the United States, there has been a lot of a lot of concern about bias in algorithms that are used in the justice system, advanced parole systems, for instance. And I think there are good reasons to be concerned, like the people have found biases in those algorithms and so forth. But why are people using those algorithms in the first place? And the reason is because there are courthouses across the country that would have sometimes 6,000 cases that they need to process. And if those cases are not processed, these people are still on, being detained, until, their parole hearing can happen and so forth. So yeah, maybe, there is bias when you do it with a machine. There is bias when you do it with a human. But when you do it with a human, there is bias and there is the weight, because of the overload. And if we only focus on the bias in the case of the machine and we don't put it on the larger context, we may be not judging things correctly. We may kind of like be being too harsh, when there's something that is improving the state of a system, and we're not doing it too constructively, because at the end, I'm a big believer that the people that develop the algorithms, the people in the courthouses, the people that are affected, many of them do want to improve the system, and they want to be able to do the things better. And they have problems of scalability, of being overworked, and so forth. So if it's done constructively, you can improve. Of course, we know from the literature that to be constructive, to be able to improve, to be able to be creative, you need kind of like a safe environment in which you can have mistakes. We might not be having that right now. So when I talk more in confidence with colleagues, in the Bay Area, and off the record and privately, many of them do tell me, like, we're not touching that with a 100-foot pole because they're afraid of getting burned. When these are colleagues that would have the capacity to maybe, try and improve those systems, because, they are not only aware of the issues, but they are also aware of how to build them, which is really hard. There's, a lot of people that can complain about these things, but there are few people that can improve them, and we want to empower those people. So a little bit like the book, when I out on a limb, on a space in which I didn't have much experience before, by creating a very comprehensive set of experiments, diving deep into the literature, learning from those experiments, but also trying to come up with a volume of work that says, let's put this into context and let's try to be a little bit more constructive at whether we can improve using technology and how, and whether we're improving with respect to the current system, because our system right now is not perfect. And comparing AI or machines or any type of system with perfection can be a loser proposition. You may be giving up the opportunities to improve certain systems, to improve the life of certain people because of a criteria that might be unrealistic, that is not pegged down to reality, which is what I think we should do.
Now, I like you're talking about intent, and you said that when we're evaluating human actions, we tend to focus on the intent to some degree, whereas when we look at kind of automated decision-making or decision-making by, robots or algorithms, we discount intent. But what does it really mean to think about intent? You had some interesting comments on, when people are thinking about the intent of the algorithm, how do they think about that differently from the intent of humans? And does it depend kind of on how much we anthropomorphize the kind of algorithm? You mentioned in the book about how, people can develop emotional attachment to, robots and things like that. If we did kind of develop that attachment, or if the decision maker was anthropomorphized in some way, would we then start to attribute intent more to the algorithm?
So that's a good question, and I can talk a little bit more knowledgeably about it because it's part of the research that I'm doing right now. So I'm working with a grad student here, Jingling Zhang, and basically what we're trying to do is to understand why people judge humans and machines differently, and what we're doing is looking at the way in which people judge humans and machines by looking at the way in which people build mental models of other people. And we know from modern psychology, but we know also going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, that the way that people make mental models of other people is mainly across two dimensions, agency and experience. Are you capable of doing stuff, or are you capable of feeling stuff? So humans tend to see other humans as very capable of doing things and very capable of feeling stuff. So they're high in agency, high in experience, so they have high moral agency and high moral status. For instance, a baby would be very high on experience, like a 5 months old baby is precious. You shouldn't damage, you should protect it, but it's very low on the agency. It's not capable of doing things, so you have kind of like those two dimensions, and you can position, machines and humans and animals, in that space. And apparently we do that, within our minds. Now, machines, are perceived to be intermediate in levels of agency, but very low in levels of experience. Mm-hmm. So the robot cannot feel, but the robot can do. And you got to start thinking of modifying how much you make people believe that the robot can do. Is this, a robot that is, very capable? So you describe a situation in which you have like, an advanced robot, that it's very, anthropomorphized in its capacities, but also maybe in its experience, or maybe all in its capacities, but not in its experience, and you kind of start, nudging those descriptions to like move around, the robot point a little bit within that agency experience space, and see how that then affects the way in which people judge humans and machines. What we do find is that, and what we do know from the literature is that experience is very much about the status. So whether it's permissible to do something to a machine, but to your question, agency is the one that is related to intent. So the more people would believe that a machine is capable of reasoning, understanding the consequences, choosing the actions, the more, that machine should move to the let's say, right in the scale of intent, the more the machine is just like stupid and, doing the same thing all the time, then the more it will move to less in intent. Now, you can unpack that a little bit more because intent is a continuous. You can think, of intent not only as kind of like this internal agency and drive, but whether something is doing what it is intended to do. So think of a self-driving car that is programmed to save pedestrians at all costs or to save drivers at all costs. And in the same scenario, it has a different outcome. Well, it's not because it was intending to run over a pedestrian or, intending to injure the driver, but it's because it is behaving as it is intended to do so. So if you have objective functions and you have machines that can choose how to behave within those objective functions, you are endowing them with some level of agency. And I think people tend to see that, and we're now trying to see if we move that agency around, whether we can change the judgments that people have.
I mean, it's kind of like if you get bitten by a dog, right? I mean, you blame the dog, but you also kind of blame the owner. So, to what extent does kind of moral blame kind of ascend through the organization, right? Go to whoever it is that programmed the agent or who owns the agent or on whose behalf the agent is acting. And what does this say about kind of responsibility and delegation, right? I think in the book you talk about how, if you have a human who's doing something, well, you can kind of insulate yourself from blame and, heads can roll and you can kind of move on. But if it's an algorithm, then, you can't just sort of fire the algorithm and move on. And some extent you as the principal have to take responsibility.
Yeah, that was a finding that was quite clear. I don't think it's very counterintuitive. It's kind of obvious, but I think it's important, because it tells you that when in some examples we would ask people who was responsible for the action, whether it was the principal, like the main organization that hired the team, or whether it was like the team or the AI that executed the action. And as soon as the action was executed by an AI, the responsibility shifted completely almost to the parent organization. So let's say you are a major newspaper and you start producing a new section, and it's written by machines or it's written by a team of journalists fresh out of college, and they publish something controversial and everything comes falling down on the Twitterverse, and then you have to like retract it and take action. If it was a machine, the responsibles are going to be the top heads of the organization. If it was a team of college students, you fired the team of college students and you took care of the problem, and you save much more face in the context of that organization. So that's a little bit of like what that part of the book appears to suggest. Yeah.
I have to say that some of the images in the book were difficult to forget. You had to concoct some images that there was purity, and then there was fairness, and the when it came to fairness, then the humans were really the ones that kind of took the blame much more so, but also in this area of purity, right? The robots were, how are they going to know, right? They're not going to know that these things are. We give them a little bit of leeway because we understand that they're not going to get these subtle human cues, right?
Yeah, like things like sacred. So I borrowed a scenario from Jonathan Haidt's questionnaire in which a robot or a human cleans a bathroom with a flag, and in that scenario, the human gets a much harsher judgment in comparison. But, I think it's exactly what you're saying here, which is the machine gets a pass because it's not expected to know that the flag of, your country is, pure, sacred in some way.
So I think both these books were fascinating. In the end of this book, you actually spent some time talking about how you wrote this book, and I was really glad that I read that kind of appendix. Sometimes you skip the appendices, but I was really glad that I read that because it gave a window into kind of not just your mind, but your process by which you took what was in your imagination and put it into sort of solid form, which I still have the solid form. Just maybe we can end on this note, but how is it that your mind works? You kind of seem like you have restless curiosity, and that you have a question, you pursue it, and then it raises more questions, and then you pursue it, and you don't seem to respect any disciplinary boundaries. How do you pursue a career like that? Do you find that to be difficult in some ways? Do you have difficulty figuring out kind of where you fit within the academic infrastructure?
Yeah, it's hard. I like to say life is too short to have one career. And it sounds counterintuitive, but the idea is that since life is short, you want to try a lot of things because you get only one life, And in that context, I've loved exploring different things and going deep into different topics at different stages in my life. I as I was coming of age, I did my undergrad and my PhD in physics, and I think I got a good understanding of how physics works, but then I got very much interested on questions of economic development. I've worked for many years on the geography of knowledge, and developed machine learning methods to understand the geography of knowledge that have been very well received. Now I'm also interested in questions of moral philosophy, and for instance on digital democracy, I've started to work with lawyers and designers and computer scientists in creating platforms of participation and figuring out how to make law more accessible and how to provide civic education about some of these issues, through technology. And the reason why I do that is because I think a lot of the learning happens on the first part of the learning curve. I'm a big fan of this guy called Leon Thurston, which among many of the things that he did, in his PhD, he established the concept of learning curve, and the learning curves are very steep in the beginning, and then you start hitting diminishing returns. So, I studied physics, for like eight years, my undergrad and my PhD. I did a lot of learning there. I'm not at a level in which I could make a contribution to fundamental physics at all, but I think I understand how it works. I've been working on economics for about 16 years now, so I don't have a formal degree, but I am not new to the field. I know, most of the concepts and models and the things that get repeated, and you do also start kind of like hitting those diminishing returns. Now I've also become interested on these other questions of moral philosophy, and I'm learning a lot. At some point when you are at the top of the learning curve, when you've been in a field too much, you start facing kind of like that grind in which now you're kind of like splitting hairs, to be at the edge of kind of like a mountain that a lot of people have already climbed. And I don't shy away from being driven by curiosity. At the same time, I know that I pay a price for it. It's difficult. It's hard. You don't have a home. Academia can be a little bit parochial. People want to support and grow people from their own community. But I also know that there's a lot of students out there and people that are also curious, and that they enjoy working with me. They come to me for advice, and we end up always developing good relationships that I think help them in some way immunize from some of the problems that I had to face.
Well, you say that objects are where we deposit information, and these are some great objects. Why Information Grows, check it out. It's really a classic, I think, now. And your most recent book, How Humans Judge Machines, very provocative, and hopefully just the beginning of a whole line of inquiry that you're going to continue to pursue. Thank you so much, César, for joining me.
Thank you, Greg. It was my pleasure.
This is Unsilo, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.